you, everyone. Committee will thank you, everyone. The committee will continue its examination of the National Emergency Management Agency. Senator Davey, you have the call.
Thank you very much. I just want to come to the Colvin review and some of the recommendations and assessments contained therein. I'm concerned about page 21 of the final report, where the review found that structurally the DRFA has accessibility issues whereby program configuration and administrative design hinders some jurisdictions and non-government organisations from accessing support, thereby creating inequities. Would you agree with that assessment? And if so, how can we improve the structure of the DRFA to improve accessibility?
Thanks very much, Senator. I'll make a top-line response and then I'll ask the Coordinator-General to provide some additional remarks. I think we welcome the report from Mr Colvin. We did want advice from him about his perspective on the funding arrangements in particular. It's worth noting that we also, of course, commissioned Mr Glasser to undertake a review of the governance arrangements associated with our national arrangements, essentially, and the way that we work with other jurisdictions. And the recommendations from both of those gentlemen are very important to us. We are working through Mr Colvin's recommendations with states and territories in particular, and consulting with them on their perspective on these same issues. And it's really important that we do so, as we've observed in answers to questions this morning. This really is a collaborative exercise. At its heart, the Commonwealth Government plays a role when events exceed the capacity of a local jurisdiction to respond to them. That's at the heart of the existing arrangements. We don't have any recommendations in front of us that recommend that that be changed in essence. And so any response that we provide to the recommendations from Mr Colvin or Mr Glasser need to be developed in consultation with our state and territory partners and with input from other stakeholders. In terms of the DRFA arrangements, we do, of course, seek continuous improvement. We're always looking at what's happening and what we can do better. We have, in the last 6 months, and in preparation for this higher risk weather season, made a number of changes which we judged would make it easier for jurisdictions to access and switch on some of that financial support that is available for communities. And I'll ask Mr Moon to talk you through some of that work.
Thank you very much, Minister. Senator, yes, the independent reviewer did make commentary around accessibility, equity, structural design of the DRFA. And I think it's important to note, from a contextual point of view, this was post the largest floods this nation had ever experienced. And so the size, the scale, the impact, and also those repeat events really put pressure on not only the design of the policy and the guideline, but also the agencies, the local governments, the community groups that were meant to administer it. And also community expectation, I think, Senator, has certainly evolved over the years. But bearing that in mind, N.E.M.A has always focused on improving that accessibility and the equity piece. Can I just go to the Category C grants at the moment? There was a time where primary producers and small business would have to retell their stories over and over again, provide invoices, provide a whole range of evidentiary information to support any request for funding. The administration of that has changed completely now that we have redesigned those grants, so that those sectors can now provide a photo or an estimate to start that funding, so they don't have to go through that really administratively complex space as well. And that's been done to a number of programs. The mental health programs is another example where we've refined the guidelines. We have standard guidelines that now can be accessed very quickly. I think some of the core frustrations that informed the independent reviewer's view of the arrangements. He heard from local government about the difficulty in mobilising support for the rebuild of their roads. And I think it's fair to say there are a number of controls there really in the guideline. It's how they're administered is the with where the complexity comes in. We just need to know, was that asset damaged? What did it look like beforehand, and what are you going to do to fix it up? And can you cost that, please?
And
I
some
think
states take those 3 points and say, when they say, what did it look like before, they're asking for a photo of the culvert the week before the flood, and councils have told me it's impossible for us to have photographs of every single one of our 5,000 assets, and they're not accepting the photos of the damage as proof of damage, because they're claiming that in their applications they're told, well, we need a before and after photo. I can understand insurance companies require that for asset insurance and households, but I'm even hearing that some insurance companies make life easier than trying to apply for DRFA for roads and bridges and the like.
yes, and we certainly recognise some of those design challenges. It also goes to some of those states and local governments hadn't experienced an event where they'd actually had to implement the disaster recovery funding arrangements. To that extent, though, Senator, we've been working now, so this is N.E.M.A, working with states and also local governments around the country to really uplift that understanding about what's actually required to access those funds promptly. And I think importantly too, advances have been made to states around the country of their estimate of their program. So that facility was made available, so fast tracking of support could be enabled by the state. So that's the approach we've taken, Senator.
So when Mr Colvin observed that government officials who administer the DRFA describe its application as confusing and difficult to work within, is the work you've just described of going out there, talking to LGAs and state governments to address that observation? And was that observation about others like state and local government, or are there some N.E.M.A officials who are confused about?
I think, Senator Davey, the best way to answer this is to say that we are working on the parts of the system where we can best have best effect. We want to make sure that our state and territory partners who lead on recovery have really clear advice from N.E.M.A about the sorts of support that they can provide to their communities. And that's true for whether it's support provided to councils through that Category B funding that I think you're referring to now, or support that might be available as extraordinary assistance through Category C and D. In each of those areas, we have worked with our state counterparts, informed by consultation with local government and other stakeholders, to make sure they have really good information and clear information about what is within the funding guidelines. We try to make it flexible, we try to make it responsive to need, but we maintain a focus on accountability because that is important to us as well. Mr Moon has just spoken with you about some particular examples of changes that we've been able to make that we do think makes it easier for councils to access money. One of those has been the willingness to advance funds to states and territories so that prior to expenditure, so that they may assist their councils quickly. Other changes that we've made have gone to standardising packages or forms of support so that we can quickly assess an application from a state or territory partner as being eligible, and that allows us to quickly mobilise resources for that affected community.
And does that also include clarifying where betterment can come into play? Because in the past there's been you're not allowed to have betterment. I know that federal government has been open to betterment. There's still a lack of understanding from a lot of local governments. So how does betterment come into play? And is it now across the board that councils or others can apply for, when they're applying for DRFA funding, can include betterment in the proposal?
I might, from a practical perspective, just sort of outline some of the work we've done, but then hand from a policy perspective to Dr. Charker. But we've been involved in multiple workshops with discrete local governments and the local state entities working through a range of their betterment options and the treatment options they'd be looking at, providing that policy advice on what potentially would be eligible and also the approach that they could take to betterment. And that's happened in multiple states, Senator. I might hand to Dr. Charker.
Yeah, Senator, just on betterment, as you've noted, that sometimes is an area where people aren't clear about what's possible. As part of some of the standardisation and improvement initiatives the Minister also touched on earlier, we developed a series of new advisories effectively, so quite clear guidance notes for states and territories, one of which went specifically to betterment and resilient infrastructure. And how it works in the DRFA is that for a given asset which is damaged by a disaster event, which would ordinarily be in scope certainly of Category B for reconstruction, the state may choose to request Category B, of course, for that for reconstruction, plus additional funds for its betterment through Category D. So that extra amount that it would cost to better or harden that asset falls under Category D. And we've now, as I said, developed an advisory to support state, territory and local government recovery practitioners to understand where that is. We have... there has been almost, I'd say, $1 billion of betterment funding which has been allocated or approved by the Commonwealth dating back to 2021 under Category D arrangements, as I've outlined, Senator.
Okay. And just finally, the government's had the Colvin report for 10 months and the Glasser report for similar. How many recommendations have been considered in detail? I note that you have to work with the state governments on a lot of them, but for the recommendations that could be addressed by the federal government alone, how are we tracking?
I think it's best if this answer is provided in two parts. The Glasser review has been, many aspects of that have been progressed, not just unilaterally by the Australian government, but also by states and territories, because many of those recommendations go to the organisational arrangements that we have amongst ourselves to coordinate our efforts. In relation to the Colvin review, we are working through all of the recommendations before we provide a response on any individual matter. There are some aspects of Mr Colvin's work that were under consideration already by N.E.M.A at the time he undertook his work, and we could point to examples of things that are already occurring at the Commonwealth level which align with Mr Colvin's recommendations. But we're not in a position today to walk you through each of those because we simply haven't finished the work that's necessary to respond to that report.
So, and chances of having those responses prior to the election?
Well, we'll release the report when that work's been done with the states and territories. One of the challenges in doing policy reform in the emergency management sector is that everybody is very busy from October to March. And it's one of the things we actively think about. If, you know, much of the work that we need to do with our state and territory partners needs to be done between March and September. That is just the reality of working in this environment. We couldn't responsibly ask people to divert staff resources away from some of the activities they're presently engaged in to do this kind of policy reform. We progress it as far as we can, but we are conscious of not seeking to burden our state and territory partners. They are primarily focused on questions of response and early recovery at this point in the cycle.
Thank you. I'm done.
Great, thank you. Senator Ghosh, did you have a couple of follow-ups, and then I might be done with N.E.M.A after that?
I do, thank you. Can I just pick up on the answer that was given in relation to the $1 billion that's allocated to the DRF funding or project? DRF, sorry. Is it possible to have that number in terms of the last 12 months and then also where it's gone states and territories wise?
Dr. Charker can speak to you a little about some of the way that those allocations have worked, and perhaps about one or two of the projects which I think are emblematic of the kinds of investments that are possible through this fund.
Yeah, thanks, Senator, for the question. So, in relation to the Disaster Ready Fund, as you'll be aware, there's $200 million of Commonwealth funds allocated each year for 5 annual rounds of the Disaster Ready Fund. Monies and projects have been approved for the first 2 rounds, so DRF rounds 1 and 2. The Commonwealth contribution is complemented by additional contribution from the project grantee or the project proponent, which often is a state government or other entity. So it ends up being sizably more in total, that money that's being invested in risk reduction and resilience, than just the $200 million Commonwealth contribution as well. In relation to state breakdowns, to give you a sense, perhaps for the most recent round 2, that of course saw the $200 million allocated, as I've already noted, as the total amount per annum. It saw about $7.6 million allocated to the ACT, approximately $42 million to New South Wales, $16 million to Northern Territory projects, about $30 million to Queensland, about $20 million to SA, about $8 million to Tassie, about $38 million to Victoria, and approximately $38 million again to WA. And there are different numbers of projects, etc., covered in those dollar amounts. In terms of a couple of key projects which, to use the Minister's term, are emblematic of this program, one of them would include, under round 1 of the program, funding of $20 million to the Household Resilience Program in central and northern Queensland. So that was funding to assist eligible homeowners in coastal parts of that northern region to improve the resilience of their homes against cyclones. A second one went to some support for vulnerable households to heat waves, and there have been other examples of disaster ready fund allocations elsewhere to support the design of cyclone shelters and the like.
Thank you. Can I ask about the Emergency Response Fund, which I think was the structural predecessor to this? And I understand that was established in 2019. Happy if you need to take this on notice, but are you aware of how many resilience or mitigation projects were completed under the auspices of the Emergency Response Fund?
Yes, I can provide that, Senator. So the information I have is that projects that are in the closure phase, which is 91 or to 100% complete, at 30 September is 28, and that's of the total 119 projects for that ERF. Thanks, Senator.
Okay. Can I ask in relation to the prepositioning of assets, which was one of the questions that, or one of the answers that emerged to one of the questions before, and one of the observations was around prepositioning of assets in Western Australia for this season. Is there a framework or a basis on which that's done that's publicly available, or is that a dynamic process internally?
Yeah, thanks, Senator. It's actually it's a dynamic model at the. So again, we work with the state in the first instance, and then we look at where it needs to be pre-positioned. In relation to aircraft, it is actually done by the commissioners and chief officers. So N.E.M.A does not have a role in that, although we do co-chair the commissioners and chief officers meeting, but it is an operational decision that is done on risk. In relation to our National Emergency Management Stockpile, we're still evolving on that, but the main positioning is South Australia and Victoria Victoria, South Australia in particular, because it can actually move in different areas, and we're looking at future options to have those capabilities pre-positioned. But the operational pre-positioning is really a call from the states, and we then support that.
In terms of having stockpiles pre-positioned in South Australia and to an extent in Victoria, is part of the thinking around that the stockpile materials are required later in the process or in the aftermath, or are they also required as preventative or prophylactic measures?
More so, again, depending on what the scenario is and the lead time for any event, there is the option to pre-position. So the arrangements are such that after discussions with the respective jurisdiction, we can pre-position. The main rationale in the first instance with South Australia and Victoria is close to transport hubs and the distribution, either east, west or north, in particular with South Australia.
In relation to the new aerial assets that the agencies acquired or obtained, can I just understand, are they assets that the agency owns or are owned by the Commonwealth Government, or are they leased from service providers either nationally or at a state level?
So again, we work through the National Aerial Firefighting Centre that is run by the Australasian Fire Authorities Council. That has been the arrangement that's been in place. What we do is fund the capability. The difference this year, though, is we've been very specific around the scope of those capabilities. So the multi-use capabilities and the heavy airlift capabilities, which is also aligned to the recommendations of the Royal Commission. So that's been the focus, but they are funded and facilitated through those national arrangements.
Are you able to provide an update in relation to the Kununurra Regional Multi-Purpose Emergency Evacuation Centre in terms of where that's at and if there are any updates?
So, Senator, that was funded under round 2 of the Disaster Ready Fund to the tune of approximately 14 million in Commonwealth funding. We certainly are in the process at the moment of signing the relevant agreements with states and territories for the release of that funding. And in fact, we have 6 schedules that have been signed with all of this, with the states and territories for that. So that project falls under that. And in fact, I'm just checking my notes here. The WA schedule has been signed. So what that means now is that lead agencies have got 3 months to then submit to N.E.M.A an implementation plan around that project. So we're likely to be awaiting, I'd say, the implementation plan. I'll take on notice the status for that particular project of where it's at. When we receive the implementation plan, that enables that project lead to start accessing and drawing down on Commonwealth funding. They can actually start the project sooner than that using the relevant state or other funding if they wish, if they want to get on with it. But to access Commonwealth funding, they need an implementation plan. So I'll take on notice the status of that plan.
Thank you. One of the observations or one of the aspects of the work that N.E.M.A has been doing is relating to future-proofing regions, communities and towns that are at risk of either flooding or fires and the like. Is there an indication of which towns are likely to receive that future-proofing or the process by which those towns are selected?
So it's, thank you, Senator. So really what you've described is, do we have an understanding of the vulnerabilities of particular communities, infrastructure, that built environment, and also the communities, to particular hazards around the nation? Each state is responsible for conducting their own risk assessment and also having treatments for that. But certainly we are looking, and at some of the work that we are doing with the Hazard Insurance Partnership, we're starting to look at some of the data sets that informs the insurance industry and how we can use that to identify the vulnerabilities and importantly what our priorities should be in terms of investment and also design of policy and also investment in capabilities into the future so that we can actually deal with those.
And I should say, Senator Ghosh, that this is one of the examples that was asked about earlier about investment in capability. So we haven't previously had a data set of this kind, but N.E.M.A is working through the partnership that's been established with the insurers to understand the risk profile of various regions across the country so that we can drive our investments. And again, it's a feature of our government. We understand that investments in resilience will be necessary. It's why we've established the fund, but it's also why we've made the investments in capability in this agency so that we can have a good data set and a good evidence base on which to make future decisions.
Final question. In terms of that insurance data, is that something that the companies are sharing with you, or is that something you're inferring from pricing?
Dr. Chapman.
Yeah, Senator. So under the Hazards Insurance Partnership that the Minister just referred to, the insurance companies who are members of that partnership are sharing the data with the ABS, the Bureau of Statistics, not with N.E.M.A, because that way all of the full confidentiality provisions of the ABS can be applied. ABS can then also link that data to some other data sets, again in a highly confidentialised manner, so that the benefits of other data sets, like if you think about socioeconomic data about individuals, whether they receive pensions, employment status, income, all of that can be linked, which gives you a much richer picture of risk, not just in terms of risk of a hazard in an area and insurance information about that, but also the nature of the community that lives in that area as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Ghosh. That's all the questions we have for the National Emergency Management Agency. Thank you for your hard work during this high-risk weather season. We're going to have a very brief suspension from broadcast while we swap over to the next agency.